hundreds of years, Cuba, the Cubans and the Americans had been friends. We had gone there, invested. A lot of American companies were there. It was really, it almost was an annex in the 19th century, and it was as close as being another state or a territory as you could be without actually being annexed. The Cuban people went back and forth. The U.S. Mafia was there. It was all very chummy, the relationship between the Cuban elite and America, especially the Miami, the Florida people, the big banks, big oil companies, big fruit companies, sugar companies, and all that. So it was a very, very close relationship. When Fidel Castro and his brother and eventually Che Guevara decided to re-invade the island. They tried to stage a coup in 1953 revolution. It failed utterly. They went to jail. They finally got out, and they went to Mexico. In 1956, they came back on a fishing boat called the Granma, and they made it all the way from the coast of Mexico to the eastern end of the island, and they landed, and lo and behold, this is 1956, the Cuban army was ready for them, so they shot them up, and they escaped up into the mountains, and they started a guerrilla movement, and they were self-taught. They didn't know really much about warfare, but they went up into the mountains. They made friends with the peasants. They armed themselves. They attacked little army garrisons and police stations, armed themselves, and they lived off the land. And little by little, they were converted into, it was partly a publicity coup, they became sort of heroes. They broadcast on portable radios. They had interviews with American journalists. And little by little, the image of Fidel and his ragged band of idealists got out into the world. And so American public opinion began to support the overthrow of the corrupt Batista government. That actually occurred. It took 3 more years for this to finally culminate, but on January 1st, 1959, Fulgencio Batista, the dictator, flew off to the Dominican Republic, and Fidel Castro and his people marched into La Habana and took it over. So that was the triumph of the Mexican Revolution. No one knew exactly what was going to happen. It was all up in the air. The U.S. State Department was a little uncertain. The CIA was, of course, very suspicious. But they said, well, let's try to make a go of it. Well, Fidel was very full of himself and decided to challenge the old man Eisenhower and challenge the world. So he really stood up to the United States and became a nationalist, an ultranationalist. He wanted to take over. He wanted to throw out the big companies, throw out the mafia, end the corruption that had been so endemic in the island. He did all these very, very reformist things. And for a year or so, people on the outside in Europe and the United States were willing to work with him, say, yeah, okay, well, maybe he's a little excessive, but he's doing the right thing. He's getting rid of the mafia. He's getting rid of prostitution. He's getting rid of drugs and all that. And he's got the right instincts. But little by little, this challenge became more and more difficult to ignore, and the United States then drifted into a conflictive revolution, kind of like what's going on between the United States and Iran over the last 5 or 6 years. Irreconcilable differences. And when that happened, then it became clear that the United States was going to have to take a very strong stand and take action against the Castro regime. In 1960-61, we broke off relations with the island. We retaliated by cutting off shipments of oil and other strategic goods. And Fidel then turned, with a great smile, he turned to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and Nikita Khrushchev was quite happy to embrace Fidel because that gave him an operating base within the sphere of influence of the United States, 90 miles from the border. So this created a huge confrontation. Everyone expected, there were rumors that the United States would invade, which in fact we did in the Bay of Pigs in 1961. It was a fake invasion, but it was nonetheless a U.S. CIA financed invasion. And then there were a lot of CIA operations going on. It was Allen Dulles was still in charge of the CIA, and he had all sorts of surreptitious ways to try to overthrow Fidel and undermine the Cuban government. So in that situation, people in the play, people were caught up in the speculation about what's going to happen, who's doing what to whom, and people were spying on one another. People were trying to get out. People were they were actually going back up in the mountains to fight against the Castro regime. Especially in the southern mountains in the Escambray, there was a pretty strong guerrilla movement up there in 1961-62 that they eventually collapsed. But so there was a lot of turmoil on the island, a lot of economic distress, And obviously, no one knew what was going to happen. It was really a very, very troubling time for everyone.